Okay, hello everybody. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker of today, Dr. Michael Proulx from the University of Bath. Michael is a reader in psychology and director of the Cross-Modal Cognition Lab at the University of Bath in the UK. He's also co-founder of the Reveal Research Center. So Reveal stands here for Real and Virtual Environments Augmentation Labs. He's also a co-investigator of the UPRA Research Center CAMRA 2.0. So CAMRA stands here for Center for the Analysis of Motion Entertainment Research and Applications. And he's also a doctoral supervisor in the Center for Digital Entertainment and Art AI. So this stands for Accessible, Responsible, and Transparent Artificial Intelligence in the Department of Computer Science. So lots of acronyms here, but all very interesting keywords, I would say. Michael received his bachelor's in psychology from Arizona State University, and then afterwards his MA and PhD in psychological and brain sciences from Johns Hopkins University. Michael was a research fellow in Düsseldorf in Germany and a lecturer in the School of Biological and Chemical Sciences at Queen Mary University of London before moving to Bath. He's a fellow of the Society for Experimental Psychology and Cognitive Science of the American Psychological Association, and he's also a fellow of the Royal Institute of Navigation. He's currently on a 2-year sabbatical at Facebook Reality Labs Research, which is in Seattle. So he is joining us from Seattle and not from Bath. And we're very happy that he's here at this very early hour for him. So thank you very much, Michael, for joining us. The title of his talk will be Seeing with Technology, Exchanging the Senses with Sensory Substitution and Augmentation. And we're very excited to have you, Michael, and we're very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Petra and Stephanie, and everyone for joining me from whatever time zone you might be in. So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, whatever might be the case for you. I just realized I'm wearing my Brains beer shirt, and so it's a little early here for beer, but maybe the brains are appropriate for this wonderful seminar series. And thank you so much for organizing it, Petra and Stephanie. So of course, if there's any problems hearing or seeing anything, please do stop me and let me know. And as Petra said, if you do have any questions, please let them know, and I'd be happy to clarify things as I go through the talk. In the past seminars, I've really enjoyed a lot of the discussion that's arisen from the talks that have been given. And so I'm hoping to introduce a number of ideas that you'll find interesting and leave plenty of time for discussion when we get to the end. So first of all, although it's just me giving this talk, we'd like to emphasize all of this work came about through a bunch of wonderful collaborations, mostly centered around the Cross-Modal Cognition Lab at the University of Bath. In this image here, you see some of the members of the lab and associated labs. Not everyone can make it on photograph day 2 years ago, unfortunately. But you might notice Karen Petrini in the front here, who gave a wonderful talk a couple of weeks ago on this series about her work in music, and a number of other collaborators, including some collaborators at Bath Spa University, Dr. Alexandra De Souza and Dr. Dave Brown, who's now at the University of Bolton. And as Petra noted, there are a number of acronyms I'd like to thank for funding or research resources, all sort of shown along the bottom there. And indeed, as Petra mentioned, I just started a 2-year sabbatical at Facebook Reality Labs Research over here in the Seattle area. What does it mean to see? Now, unfortunately, in this format, this is a rhetorical question. Normally, I would like this not to be a rhetorical question, if possible, but perhaps in the discussion at the end, we can ponder this question a bit more and the different answers you might have. It seems like such a simple question, right? It seems like even when my children were little, they could probably give me a good answer to this question. And indeed, it's always interesting to hear what children, much less other scientists, might say for answering this question. And one of the reasons is because it seems simple in a sense, because we as humans, as primates, most of us see very well. even when compared to other mammals. And it's something we do without much thought. It just happens. We open our eyes and we suddenly can understand things around us. You know, it's something we can sort of take for granted in many ways. We are not the only ones who can take it for granted, at least in terms of its complexity. I found this memo from MIT's AI group from 1966, where they defined something called the Summer Vision Project, where they had hoped that they would be able to make significant progress in solving vision over a summer using a number of summer interns, I imagine undergraduate students at MIT, who would, at least in this case, they still have to define it, try to solve the issue of pattern recognition. So seeing as something like that. Now, as many of you know, these problems in computer vision, indeed in vision science in general, weren't solved in the summer in 1966, and something we're still grappling with today. So it turns out to be a very difficult problem. Now, coming out of the MIT tradition is the late, great David Marr, who in his book Vision gave an answer to this question to start out. And he wrote that the plain man's answer, and Aristotle's too, would be to know what is where by looking. Now, of course, that was in the introduction of his book, and he went into great detail of the computational mechanisms of all the more complex aspects of knowing what and knowing where things are by looking. But it's a start. And you know, we need to have some sort of starting understanding of the phenomena we want to understand before, of course, we can restrict the sorts of questions we're going to ask about it. Now, what is, I think, more appropriate for this amazing seminar series is a broader question that allows us to take vision as potentially as a model for the other senses, but also as something that interacts with the other senses. And perhaps the bigger question we should consider is, what does it mean to perceive? Because we are not just visual beings. You know, humans have many other senses, many of which have been described in a lot of the talks in the series. You know, we see, hear, touch, taste, smell, and many more, sort of a number of images along the bottom to represent many more. And we do all of these things. We have all of these sensory phenomena, all these experiences occur in our brain. So not in the eyes, ears, fingers, mouth, or nose. You know, so many of the important contributions, not all, many of the important contributions are being computed in the brain. And then that's where all of these phenomena arise from. And so there's an interesting step that could be logically taken from that if all these things are largely occurring and being computed in the brain, then if we are deprived of one sense, the other senses can compensate or even substitute for the missing sensory modality. So perhaps in the cases of hearing impairment, for example, or vision impairment, the other senses can sort of fill the gap in the sorts of information those senses normally provide. So where are we going today? Well, what I want to describe is how visual impairments inspired my research into atypical augmented reality and virtual reality. Certainly working with the next couple of years with Facebook Reality Labs and the Oculus team, virtual reality will be a major interest, and augmented reality devices as well. But my foray into these areas really started with visual impairments, and in particular, sensory substitution and augmentation. And what I also will talk about today is using these as a means of understanding information processing and capacity limitations, and ideas about multisensory integration and multisensory cooperation. So again, in relation to this series, you know, when I'm thinking about what does it mean to perceive, I'm thinking about how our experience of the world and ourselves is multisensory. And the reason I think that's a core thing to keep in mind is that when anyone is studying one of the senses potentially on their own, it's always important to think about how that sense is interacting with our other senses to give us a full experience of the world. One example is a recent interesting paper from Marty Banks's lab that was examining an anatomical issue about why animal eyes have pupils of different shapes. And in this case, the focus was very much just on the eyes themselves and examining the way the shape of the pupil directs the light in such a way that it is hitting the most sensitive areas of the retina for each species. And those sensitive areas of the retina, like such as the fovea that we're very familiar with in humans, tends to match the structure of the pupil. Now, what I found really interesting about that is they seem to have not noticed that in prior literature, particularly work by two partner scientists, the Hefners, has examined this sort of retinal sensitivity across many species, mammals in particular, and previously noted that what they call the width of the field of best vision. So down here in this chart here, you'll see that on the x-axis, which in humans is somewhat circular when we think about our fovea, but you can compare the width of it to the width of these sensitive areas of the retina on other species, which, for example, if you think about a horse, for example, which you have up here. So this is showing this is sound localization, but you'll see we have a horse here, and then horses are sort of falling up over in this range in here on this graph. They have a wider fovea that sort of is the shape of the pupil. So you have this very wide field of best vision, sort of a wide fovea that's sensitive to information that's coming along the horizon. And the very different perspective that the Hefners have taken in their work is how this anatomical feature corresponds to the other senses, in particular here, hearing, with the thought that for many mammals who have fairly good vision, hearing is useful for directing the eyes to the correct location. And so in humans, for example, we have a somewhat narrow field of best vision for our fovea, a very small, highly sensitive area that gives us such good vision. And that corresponds to a sound localization threshold that is much smaller in order to direct our eyes to a very specific location. Whereas in other species who cannot see so well, such as say the naked mole rat, for example, they have a very wide field of vision that's not at the same level of acuity that you see in humans. So they just really need to be able to detect anything dangerous that might be coming, such as cattle might do as well, for example. And their sound localization threshold ends up being much higher. So up in this much higher, sort of less sensitive range. And so I think it's interesting that we could examine a sense like vision just sort of on its own, but we can start to see many interesting relationships for what it means to see and what it means to hear when we consider the interactions between the senses, not just in humans, but also perhaps in other species. Although in this talk, I'll mostly be focusing on our human work. Along with Alexandra de Souza, we've started examining these sorts of issues in some other species as well. So as Peter mentioned in the introduction, originally my first degree is from Arizona State University, and I actually grew up in a small village in northern Arizona called Sedona. And here's a photograph of it showing Oak Creek Canyon near where I grew up. Beautiful place to hike. And what I like about this image is the way it captures just in vision, as is appropriate for a visual-based talk like this. The many textures, colors, orientations, shapes visual features as a whole that coalesce to give us a very rich experience of the world, an experience that can be somewhat overwhelming from information processing capacity. So of course we have attentional mechanisms to be able to restrict it should we want to just look for, say, a tadpole, perhaps growing up in the creek, or perhaps a deer that might be walking through the trees in the distance. And so it can be overwhelming, but we have these mechanisms to be able to deal with that. But then in my work, I turned to studying visual impairment. And as some others who have presented in the series have noted, visual impairment provides an interesting opportunity, particularly in developmental studies, for example, where we can understand the importance of vision for the development of other perceptual or cognitive processes. Also, visual impairment gives an interesting opportunity to reevaluate that question. What does it mean to see? Because a lot of people are working on a number of non-invasive and invasive approaches to vision restoration. And having a clear definition of what it means to see and which aspects of vision, if not all of them, should be restored in those who perhaps have never seen because they were visually impaired since near birth, or lost their vision at some point during their lives. And so it's a fascinating question that I've been pondering for about the last 15 years or so. And we certainly didn't solve it in the summer by any means. And that is, how can we provide visual information to those without it? And so one of the approaches I've been using, along with a number of my colleagues, both at the University of Bath in the UK and in many countries around the world, is sensory substitution. And at its core, sensory substitution is essentially an augmented reality device. So we're taking and providing extra information to the intact senses a person has to augment their experience of the world and provide them additional information that otherwise they might not have access to. In particular, I'm going to talk about work we've been doing that tries to help people start seeing with sound or with the tongue. And so this is where the sensory information processing issue comes to the front, because it's a challenge. It's a huge challenge when thinking about how to translate information from a format that normally one sense would be able to process to a format another sense could process. And this is certainly the case when thinking about visual perception. So in vision, there are many ways you can describe the qualities of vision. Here are just a couple. One is we have, particularly in humans, excellent spatial acuity. We are one of the top mammals in terms of our visual acuity. And we also are able to process a lot of information as a function of having that visual acuity. So I have a number here by Jacobson from the 1950s. It's very similar to some work by Nilsson, who looks at the evolution of vision, and that he was able to calculate just by thinking about the number of receptors that we have present on our eye and in the fovea in comparison to other species. And the estimate here is we can process about 4.3 times 10 to the 6 bits per second from sort of this information theoretic perspective. And in many ways, we can do this in parallel. So even though we're not necessarily aware of all the information that is striking our entire retina, we are able to rapidly shift attention, either covertly or overtly with eye movements, to the location of things, suggesting that we're able to process the field in parallel such that we'll know when something important appears in another location. So when thinking about how to replace visual information, thinking about touch and tactile information processing seems somewhat natural. And in part, that's because the skin, say on the hand, works as an interesting spatial analog to the retina. because if you imagine you show some simple pattern to an eye, like say a white letter A on a black background, you can show a similar pattern to the skin, because essentially the retina is just a relatively flat piece of skin, and the image is being presented in 2 dimensions upon it. And children all the time, and people like us, probably look at the recognition ability. So you can draw a capital letter A on the hand and see how well it can be recognized. And so it's pretty easy, at least just to think how to translate that 2-dimensional information from the back of the eye to somewhere else on the skin. Certainly, as a number of other talks in the series will describe when looking at touch, the number of qualities that are quite different about it. Just one is that it does have lower acuity. Now, the acuity varies across the body. You're all familiar with the homunculus, of course, this lovely representation that shows areas that are have higher sensitivity than other areas. So you might, for example, not want to have this representation area that we don't have as much spatial sensitivity, but it does, regardless, throughout the body have lower acuity than the visual system. In terms of this bits per second approach, many orders of magnitude lower than vision, perhaps 100 bits per second by some estimates. And it tends to be something that's more recognized by serial processing. So it's much more difficult to process complex information at more than one location at a time. But these problems notwithstanding, it's a good place to start. So initially, this started already back with the late Baccarita's team in the 1960s. There's a lovely picture from their Nature paper in 1969 showing the initial approach, which involved a very large display of solenoids on that person would sit back against and feel along their back. The camera would provide the visual input. Here's a bank of some of the computers that they use to process the visual image into black and white, and then the white areas of the image would press out into the back of the person sitting in the chair. And in that and following works, they found that people could recognize patterns on their back and even respond dynamically to them. Clearly, that's not the most sort of portable type of device for being able to do more active tasks. And so the intellectual heirs of Baccarita, working with him up until he passed away, developed additional devices such as the tongue display unit, which has now become the brain port. And we have a couple pictures of one of the older brain ports down here. And you can see the image on the screen where it's representing all the pixels that are in front of the camera coming from these glasses of these little Lego toys here. And we have the newer version of the brain port in the lab here, which is just all enclosed in a headset. So it's getting a step closer to sort of the virtual reality devices like Oculus in terms of having such an approach. So all the computing is done in the headset. And here you have the display that goes onto the tongue and uses a very small voltage on the tongue to essentially present the pixels from the image across the surface of the tongue. If you haven't had a chance to experience it before, like Maurice Petito and Ron Coopers, who have done a lot of amazing work in neuroscience using the brain port or versions of it, have done demonstrations of it at conferences before. It really is a fascinating sensation. A bit like some combination of if you were to have popping candy and champagne, where you just get like sort of these bursts of popping on the tongue as a sense. At least that's the sort of perceptual sense of what it's like to have that level of voltage going across the tongue. So one of the issues here is thinking about the skin as a spatial analog to the retina and what sort of problems are still posed by that. And in particular, we've looked at this with the brain port. Now, again, the brain port is essentially reading with the tongue. And so the tongue, of course, has many differences from the retina. One in particular we're thinking about in this study, following the fascinating work by Malika Ovray and her team, was how the orientation of the surface can cause some confusion when trying to interpret information being presented on it. And the reason it can cause confusion is because, of course, the eye, normally we're standing, and so the eye is this surface that's perpendicular to the floor. The tongue, of course, is a surface that normally would be parallel to the floor. And so it's not going to be at the same angle as the eye, or indeed as the camera that the brain port uses, which is located close to the eyes. And so in a number of experiments, we examined the baseline interpretation people would make of ambiguous stimuli presented to the tongue, because we realized, based on some of this past work by Malika, that there are essentially 4 different perspectives people could use to interpret information being presented on the tongue. So it's a spatial analog for the retina, but it does cause a lot of ambiguity. And that's because you can either have self-centered perspectives that are either above or below. So if you imagine this shaped letter here, which could be interpreted as either a Q, a B, a P, or a D, if it's presented onto the tongue in the default setting of the brain port, where the top of the image is kind of flipped to the back of the tongue, so it's sort of laid down on top of the tongue like that, you could interpret it as a sort of self-centered below perspective, which is the assumption of the designers. So it's like you're looking up through the tongue and reading this letter P being presented on it through the electrical stimulation. But you could also do a self-centered above perspective, in which case it would be flipped and you'd interpret it as the letter B. But of course, it's possible you could take also these decentered above and below perspectives, in which case it would appear as either a Q or a D. And so what seems like sort of a simple spatial analog actually introduces a number of interesting problems in terms of the biases people might have and how to process this information. And so in examining this, and by the way, this is with Karen from a couple weeks ago, our PhD students, Mike Richardson and Typhoon Esenkaya Lloyd. And what we found here is, in examining the, at least in this chart here, the percentage of responses based on the letters, arrows, left-right arrows or up-down arrows for these, that you have a mixture of responses. And so there are these individual differences that make it challenging, not only in terms of individual responses, but also in terms of the specific stimuli that are being presented. So first of all, if we just look at letters, for example, so if you were using this to, say, read an eye chart at the optician, 60% of the participants we tested did use this self-centered below perspective, which is what the designers had hoped. So at least they're getting the majority. But the problem is, when it comes to technology, you really need it to work for almost everyone, almost all the time. Of course, if they're actually going to use a device like this out in the wild, you kind of need it to work for everyone all the time, for safety reasons. And so there is a certain complexity in how the information is interpreted that is possibly an issue. That said, if we switch over to arrows, we find that people were interpreting these oftentimes in a very mixed way, mostly split by whether they were left-right facing or up-down facing. The up-down were being processed in a strange way where they tended to be decentered. So they seemed to perceive these as if they were looking from another person's perspective. And the left-right arrows, at least, they seem to be seeing from the self-centered perspective. But there was a surprising variance depending on what was shown to them in terms of how they might perceive that information. And subsequently, we have some more work currently under review that Mike Richardson has been leading in our group, looking at a number of other issues in terms of the basic perceptual and attentional properties of the tongue, which is a fascinating part of the body that has been surprisingly understudied, even though it's so important to many things we do, such as eating and speaking and so on. Okay, so that's thinking about touch and thinking about the skin. Next, I want to talk about the auditory system. The auditory system has very good temporal acuity. As anyone listening to music, for example, might know, you can pick up on, or just listening to me speak, can pick up on very small differences over time. Its processing capability is higher than touch, but still much lower than vision. So estimated to be about 10 to the 4 bits per second. But the main problem is there's not a clear analog between hearing and vision as there is for touch. So how can we provide visual spatial information through sound? Well, one way we can consider it is the connections that do exist between the senses. And so I know for this audience, many of you are very familiar with these shapes, very well known and used in many different studies. If people in almost anywhere in the world, here are some colleagues from Japan we collaborate with doing research in Malaysia, asking people, well, which of these is named Buba, which of these is named Kiki? Pretty much over 90% of people would name the spiky object as Kiki and the more bulbous object as Buba. So we have these cross-modal correspondences between things we hear and things we see across a number of classes. And so in some ways, if we think of an image just as information, how can we use these cross-modal correspondences to allow us to translate it from something we see into something we hear? Well, as you've already learned from the brainport, it means we have to break down the image into small parts, which are pixels of certain sizes as represented by a grid here. And then we can think about what about that information we're seeing. So we can think about it in terms of spatial location. So there are some pixels which on the y-axis are high, on the x-axis are to the right, others are low and to the left. We can also think about the intensity. So if we're just dealing with grayscale, for example, we can just think about whether any particular square has a dark luminance or a bright luminance. And we can choose auditory representations that map onto these. And so there's a number of studies going back about 80, 90 years, looking at different correspondences we have between sounds and spatial locations and other visual properties such as brightness. And so based on a lot of that work going back a very long time, pixels that are high up can be replaced by a high pitch or a high frequency that we perceive as a high pitch. Something that's far to the right on the x-axis can be panned to the right in terms of stereo hearing it on the right. If we go down over here, if it's low, it could be a low pitch and be heard on the left if it's on the left. And if it's a bright pixel, it can be loud, can have the similar representation of intensity. And if it's dark, it can be relatively quiet. In addition, to deal with how much information is an image and how difficult it is to be able to present that in the sound, another way to help cut down the amount of information that has to be processed is adding a temporal feature, because we're using a device developed by Peter Mayer called the Voice. And what the Voice does is it takes a column of pixels at a time and presents them one after another in a rapid sequence. And so the left to right location also comes from the timing of the scan from left to right. So in this image, the scan will go from left to right. You'll hear a louder sound if it's bright, it'll be quiet if it's dark. If the bright information is high in the image, you'll hear a high frequency. If it's low in the image, you'll hear a low frequency. And so I'll give you an example of some of this in a video we made for New Scientist a few years ago. And hopefully you can hear it. If not, please flag the Petra or Stephanie, and they'll let me know. So one thing I just want to mention halfway through the video here is you'll see with the simple oriented lines, it's pretty straightforward. You know, if the line is oriented up from left to right, you can hear the frequency go from low to high. But here, when you have these photographs that Pranav Lal, who's been working with the voice for a number of years, took when visiting the Himalayas, it suddenly becomes much more complex. And one thing I find fascinating about working with the voice is the way it helps us tune into and realize the complexity of vision. You know, just how much information is present in the image, even if it's just grayscale. And you can hear that complexity in the sound, even if you forget about it when you look. So Pluto came up because not only does Pranav take these photos when he's traveling, he's held a number of photography exhibits in India, but he can also use it to try and recognize images at a basic level on the internet. So when there's something in the news, he can download the image and use the voice to listen to it. And I also just want to thank another PhD student, Jacob Hadnett-Hunter, who helped with creating this video. Okay, so there are a number of challenges that we've been able to assess. A lot of this work has been done with Dr. Dave Brown, who's now at the University of Bolton near Manchester. And in one such paper, we wanted to examine this, well, a problem that originally came from observation. And in this observation, we discovered that when a number of our participants were learning to use the voice, because in much of our work, we focused on the learning of sensory substitution. So as people go from being completely naive to gaining some level of expertise, we found a lot of participants would make errors in recognizing objects because it seemed they were mostly paying attention to just the high frequencies, so essentially the top of the image, and missing the lower frequencies, the bottom of the image. And when we noticed this just in our basic training sessions, we found, of course, we could ask them to shift their attention from the high frequencies to the low frequencies. And there wasn't a perceptual problem in that the high frequencies were not masking the low frequencies, because they could, when asked, shift their attention to low frequencies, recognize the shape along the bottom, and correct the errors they were making. And so instead, we realized there might be something more fundamental in terms of their ability to process all that information at the same time. So there has been a lot of foundational work going back to Atkinson and Schifrin in the 1970s, looking at the sorts of capacity limitations that come up in vision. And a lot of that work was surprising because, again, vision seems to have such high capacity. We often don't think of having too many limitations. And we examined this in the auditory domain using the voice. So with the voice, we would take simple black and white images of different objects. Here's a dog, a house, a car, and a horse. And either allow them to hear the presentation twice, so they could hear the whole image twice before responding, or they would hear the whole image once, but they would hear the top and then the bottom, or the bottom and then the top in succession. So they wouldn't have to process the entire thing at the same time. And so really, for the simultaneous condition here at the top, where they're hearing the top and bottom at the same time, they're getting to hear the whole thing twice and use the information as they wish. And the bottom, they're only getting all the information once, but just having it split over time. And what was interesting was looking at the object recognition accuracy. So actually we have correct response percentage on the bottom. And we're looking at this either in visual to auditory, which is in blue, or tactile to auditory, which is in red. So either we had sighted participants who could see the image and match what they heard to the image they saw, or people had to match what they heard to a felt cutout of these images. Overall, it's just sort of interesting to see that the matching between hearing and touch was higher than hearing to vision. But the main finding we're interested in terms of capacity limitations is that the successive presentation, splitting the images, gave much higher accuracy than playing the whole image simultaneously, suggesting that indeed, even with these simple black or white representations, there are these capacity limitations, and that it's difficult to, in parallel, be able to hear the top and bottom of these objects at the same time as the voice scans from one side to another. And so we did a number of studies to try and think of sort of different solutions, but mostly, again, wanting to focus on the fundamental issue of information processing. And one aspect that came out of Brown's work was thinking about information reduction. And this was for two reasons. One, to try and understand whether the number of pixels that the voice is able to present, oftentimes in sort of the basic settings of it, it can present 25,000 pixels across an image, which is quite good, compared to the brain port, which oftentimes is only able to present more about 400 pixels. So like with a 20 by 20 representation. Actually, the version we have has 396 because it doesn't have the far corners, but otherwise it's a 20 by 20 grid. And so it's presenting less information than the voice if you were to use the brain port. And indeed, if you look at the more invasive forms of vision restoration, those have very few pixels often being presented to people as well, even fewer than the brain port in some cases. And so we wanted to examine this for a number of practical and fundamental reasons. What the impact would be of reducing the amount of information in the image, here starting at 128 by 128 representations of simple images and going all the way down to incredibly hard to make out 4 by 4 image. Now, what's interesting about these is when you get down to these lower levels, one example people like to give in vision is where you can squint, and squinting kind of blurs together the pixels and sometimes helps you pull out the representation. In textbooks in the United States, they often have a photograph of Abraham Lincoln, which they pixelate, and then people can recognize it when they squint. In other places, they have La Joconde or Mona Lisa, and instead pixelate that, and people can recognize it when they squint, and sort of smooth out the rough pixelization that occurred. Whether or not that's possible to do in hearing was definitely an open question, whether people could make out enough information from the location of the pixels to determine what these objects were. And in fact, what we end up finding, just showing a subset of the data here for the 32 by 32, 16 by 16, 8 by 8, and 4 by 4 conditions resolution, looking at correct responses on the y-axis, that as we decrease the number of pixels representing the object, the accuracy did not decrease significantly, particularly across these first three conditions. It was only when we got down to this paucity of information in the 4 by 4 that we saw an enormous drop in their accuracy when learning to be able to pick up on the objects based on sound using the voice. And one thing we thought was interesting was just going back to the classic work by Paul Bach-y-Rita, where he always noted that the tongue display unit and then the brain port that he developed had poor resolution, but he always felt that provided enough information to be able to perceive complex images. because he felt like the brain can pick up on the change in the pattern of stimulation and be able to bring all of that information together in a way that it could represent and recognize complex images. So we've been interested in studying other solutions towards trying to understand how to overcome some of the information processing difficulties of representing such information. And one thing that occurred to us, particularly in collaboration with Karen Petrini, also our PhD students, here we now have Crescent Jickle, here with my daughter kindly participating in one of our studies in the VR lab, Typhoon, who I mentioned before, and a few other students, including PhD student Micah Scheller, who's now going up to Durham, former undergraduate Simon Ling Smith, and Professor Eamon O'Neill from computer science. And one thing we recognized is we were not being very multisensory about what we were doing. We were essentially just focusing on touch through the tongue, hearing through the ears, in our understanding of these problems of sensory substitution. And so what we decided to do is to see how well people could use the information from a sensory substitution device, hear the voice again, in combination with some other natural sensory information, in particular self-motion. So moving away from these sort of static tasks to taking on a more dynamic task for being able to learn the location of objects in space. So we created a slightly different version of the voice that we could use on a headset that would allow us to track the location of people in the room and the direction they were facing using these Vicon cameras. And we, across a number of experiments, examined different ways of response for noting the location of things. Here's one of our sort of floating joysticks that we use in some of these studies. So for this task, we either did an egocentric or allocentric task for being able to represent the location of, in this case, 3 objects presented in the room. There's a lot of interesting work that others have presented and that my lab has done before on spatial reference frames and how visual impairment can impact and disrupt particularly allocentric spatial reference frames in the visually impaired as being a particular challenge. And essentially that means egocentric is that the participants had to walk to a target position relative to their own position. So here they learned where these 3 objects are, and then they have to walk to an object via a route they didn't walk before. So they would just walk 1, 2, 3, and then be walked back to the start and have to mentally calculate the location of that 3rd object. So sort of a completion task. The allocentric is that they would walk between these 3 objects, but then be started from another location rather than the location of themselves at the start, and have to walk to the location of that object, again, a route they hadn't taken before, but from a different location than their original starting location. And so it's an incredibly challenging task, particularly once you take away vision. With vision, it's pretty easy. Without vision, it is challenging to gain a spatial understanding of where things are. And so in these studies, because we're training people up from being completely naive at using the voice to see with sound, require these really long training sessions to get people familiar with how it worked. And so this is a Typhoon and Crescent training one of our participants over a very long period of time. So just briefly describe some of the results, just a portion of them. Here we're examining essentially the variability in their error that the participants make in terms of the X and Y position for the correct location, which would be at the origin here in the center. So this is for one visually impaired participant at the top and one example sighted participant at the bottom. And in it, you can see the different conditions where you have either self-motion only, the voice only, the combination of the two, and using a maximum likelihood estimation of what we would expect if they were able to integrate the voice and self-motion in an ideal way. And what we're able to see is that for these visually impaired participants, for example, they were able to integrate the voice and self-motion very well. And we see something with the sighted participant happening down here as well, though there's different individual patterns in terms of the amount of variability they have for self-motion and versus using sensory substitution. And so another thing that was interesting to us to examine was not only integrating sensory substitution with something like self-motion that you naturally have, but whether taking information from two different sensory substitution devices might be able to make up for what each lacks. So particularly one thing with the voice is you're able to present a lot of pixels, many more pixels in an image compared to the brain port. But you have to deal with this, getting a snapshot of the world, say every second or 2 seconds, and scanning across it. And so you get sort of this flash of the world, wait, flash of the world, wait, over and over again. With the brain port, it's more dynamic in that as things move across in front of the camera, you'll feel them move across your tongue in short order after that presentation. And so it might have fewer pixels, 396 on your tongue, but you do get that dynamic information. And so could we perhaps combine these two together in a way that allows people to perform well with it? And so we did similar studies here in these allocentric and egocentric conditions where we combined the tongue display unit, the brain port, looked at the voice, the combination of the two, and again, this maximum likelihood estimation of being able to combine those. And what we saw here is in the allocentric conditions, people were having higher variability in combining the voice, the auditory display, and the brain port, the tongue display, in order to do this task. So they were not they're not able to integrate the two together in a way that helped their performance very much. And again, if we go over here and look at these sort of averages here, you'll see that it is higher than the maximum likelihood estimation for the allocentric task. And it's even still higher in the egocentric task as well. So it looked like in this task, they were unable to take advantage of combining the tactile display and the auditory display to carry it out. So we tried something a little bit different. And one thing that was different about it is in the active task in the room, we had trouble getting a very good spatial and temporal congruence between the brain port and the voice. And that's because we were unable to hack into the camera system in order to have one single perfectly aligned camera providing information to both the voice and the brain port. And so in order to solve that problem, we ended up building a new system, which was necessarily static, where we used one camera to feed the information into both the voice and the brain port. And that allowed us to have perfect spatial congruence between the information being provided to each, and improved temporal congruence because of the static nature of using this task here in the box. And furthermore, the information provided was held constant at that of the level of the brain port, so that what they heard was a perfect match for what they were feeling on their tongue. And so using this special box in order to present the two sensory substitution devices at the same time, we looked at this issue of pattern recognition, once again, going back to that MIT memo, across different letters and shapes. And what we found was that looking at the correct scores here on the y-axis compared to the voice, the brain port as a tactile mode in the center, or the multisensory combination of the two, that they performed above chance in all cases. So these are fairly naive participants. We had just a basic description of how the devices worked before they started. And with both letters and shapes in the voice, they were above chance. But actually, initially, with these simple objects, they performed better with the brain port than the voice. But most interestingly, they performed the best with the combination of the two, coming close to averaging 80% correct when using both the voice and the brain port. And so we think it's important that they were much more congruent in this case than we were able to do in the motion tracking lab, and that they were given equal levels of information input, possibly helping to encourage a more equal weighting of information from the two, since neither was more reliable than the other. One thing coming out of Typhoon's PhD that was interesting is some of the qualitative responses. Here, just highlighting how one participant specifically mentioned that initially I felt the combination made it more difficult to identify shapes and letters. So then I began to separate the two devices out, paying attention to the sound to get an idea of the shape, and then confirming the details with my tongue. And so it comes back, I guess, to that problem of information processing and capacity limits. So even though we're splitting the information into two different senses, these naive participants, so they're not highly trained at doing this, found it easier to use one device, the voice, to get the initial sense, the gist of the image, and then they use the brain port to try and confirm what they thought was the case through another evaluation. And a lot of these different principles, particularly with an eye towards application, are something we described in a recent paper by Typhoon and Vanessa Lloyd Esenkaya, my colleague in computer science, Amy O'Neill, in cognitive research principles and implications. So looking at multisensory inclusive design with sensory substitution as a more general idea that can be applied. So in summary, just want to mention some of the key ideas and findings I've gone over today. First of all, there can be too much of a good thing. So there can be too much information for us to process at one point in time. And these human information capacity limitations do make that a challenge. So sometimes less is more. So although the world provides an embarrassment of sensory riches, we do not really need all of it all of the time. And I think one of the challenges going forward for sensory substitution is figuring out how to take an image and reduce it to the information that a person might need for a particular task or a particular moment in time, and only presenting a subset of the information to them to overcome these differences in hearing and touch compared to vision. Also, multisensory cooperation might be just as crucial as integration. So I think a key idea that came from the end with having this box in order to combine the brain port and the voice is the idea that, and it's something that's come up in the literature over the past several years, this idea of multisensory cooperation, that it's possible that we're not getting a true integration between hearing and touch in this case, but what we're getting is cooperation in that the participants are able to extract some information through one sense, other complementary information from another, and then combine them. So rather than having redundant information that's being fully confirmed, perhaps there's something complementary instead. And ultimately, we perceive with the brains and not with our various sensory receptors. And so there's a lot of possibility for the things that we're able to do if we remember that key idea. So thank you very much for joining me today. And I look forward to your questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Michael, for a really fascinating talk. That was really interesting. Anybody who would like to ask a question live? Otherwise, we have a couple of questions in the chat. I can't see anybody raising their hand. Ella, go ahead.
I don't even raise my hand. It just starts to.
Go ahead.
Michael, excellent talk and amazing work. As you can imagine, I'm following it quite closely. I have a million questions, so I'll limit myself to some degree, and we can catch up another timing. But I'm really curious about the studies about the integration of information across sensory substitution devices and the limitations of capacity that you presented. Specifically, I'm curious how that plays out as people have more and more training. Because what we saw with the voice sensory substitution, and we trained only with the voice, but for a very long duration with a very small cohort of blind participants. And what we saw that in the beginning, it was really an effortful thing. It was really hard for them. They really need to segment the information in an effortful and cognitively strategic way, like you presented about the top and bottom. And as time went by, they really went to a degree in which they could really just perceive it more naturally. And I wonder how those things play out. The effects of different strategies and their effects on capacity and the effects of the duration of training. Can you say anything about these topics?
Yeah, absolutely. So the reason I ended up getting so interested in what happens early on was because when I first started working with the voice, I worked from the perspective of sort of intense training and then only doing analysis at the end. So, after, what was I doing at the time? I guess it was about 45 hours of training before we were doing any sort of, significant tests of people. And I agree. So you get to like a certain point in the learning curve where things seem to plateau. And for me, at least with those, it's because I stopped around that 45-hour mark or so. And it did become something they could recognize things much more quickly, with far less sort of conscious deliberation. And you do see, I think, a change happen over time. And really that is similar to the work by Atkinson and Schifrin, where, when it came to thinking about the simultaneous or successive processing and vision, with training, it became something they could overcome over time, within some, boundaries of, how much, was being presented. And so I think there's definitely that switch. And really, what I would love to have the opportunity to do is to look at that change over time. Because I think now what we have is a good slice of what happens early. And particularly like in your work, we have a good idea of what happens later. And we don't have a good documentation of the process that happens in between. And I think that from a fundamental perspective would be really, really fascinating to look at. As you know, it's very time consuming, very challenging in order to do that with significant numbers of people in order to do it. But I think that could be very valuable to do. One of the reasons we end up deciding to keep focusing on the early stages of learning was to address some of the applied aspects as well, which is in terms of the uptake of these technologies. Because as you know, very few people seem to want to take it up because that early process is so challenging. And so one thing I'm already learning, just being here at Facebook is, they only want to sell a technology once they know it works for everyone all the time and without people reading instructions. They just want people to put on their Oculus headset and figure it out. It's fun, it's easy, and you just click things and you figure it out. And that's sort of the point I think we need to get at, particularly with these non-invasive approaches. Because with the invasive ones, right, people kind of have that fun right away. They see a flash of light. It might be in the wrong location. It might not represent a straight line, even though that's being presented to them, but they have that fun feeling. And so they want that. And so with sensory substitution, I think we need to figure out what it takes to get that earlier. So that way people have that sense of fun in learning it. Because certainly, as you well know, with time, the things people can do with hearing images is remarkable. It's nothing short of remarkable. And so, yeah, I think all those processes are interesting, and it definitely changes over time with training.
Thank you. I really look forward to seeing how the research unfolds onwards. This is great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Any more live questions? Just go ahead and unmute yourself or raise your hand. Okay, I can read out the two questions that we have in the chat. Both are by Jack Conwell. The first one is, does tongue stimulation also lead to activation and perception of tastes? And then the second question is, with deep learning, isn't it better to do object recognition with a machine vision camera and then simply voice out the object names and possibly their general location?
Yeah, both very good questions. So first of all, does tongue stimulation lead to the perception of taste? And not in our studies. So, but in other research, people have been able to do so. And why that can occur with some devices, but not yet with ours, I'm uncertain. So there's a number of groups who have been working with electrical stimulation in order to try and give a sense of the basic taste categories in terms of trying to give like sort of salty or sweet type experiences that are virtual. And I don't know why using the BrainPort, we don't get something quite so similar. It could be something about the nature of the contact, perhaps the temperature, the shape. I'm not sure why we get a difference there, but we didn't always ask. So it's possible there was someone who came out there thinking that was like chocolate or something like that and didn't tell us. But definitely in all of our own pilot testing, none of us had anything beyond the basic sort of popping feeling that you get. Which also, of course, one thing to mention is you do get tired of it over time too. So you need a break from it, because even though it's a very low level, only a few volts being presented on the tongue, you're not used to having that sort of constant stimulation. And so it is something that gets a bit tiring. So if you do have the taste, it's probably very initial, and then it might quickly get washed out by the constant stimulation. The next question, so could you use sort of computer vision to try and recognize objects and then just name them in general location? And yes, you could. And of course, we know that there's lots of good sort of off-the-shelf things you can do for recognizing objects. If you just look at either Google Lens or alt text that's automatically produced by a number of companies, Google, Facebook, and so on, you can get some basic information in an image that can then be told to a person in a sense. I think the challenge is that if you go back to thinking about what does it mean to see, is whether that's always what a person wants. So in some of our motion tracking work, for example, we were less concerned with what the objects were, a pyramid, a cube, a sphere, and more interested in where they were. In other work we've done, we've looked at obstacle avoidance. And in that case, you kind of care where it is, but you more care where it is not. So you can walk along a clear path without colliding with things. And also, even when it comes just to object recognition, you might not just want to know that there's a person on the left and a box on the right. You might be interested in knowing that that person is tall or short, that that person is wearing bright clothes or dark clothes. You know, the old saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words, is really representative of the issue when you're thinking about going from computer vision to providing a full explanation of what's present, and in particular, presenting what the person wants. So the challenge here is you could use, like some sort of machine learning mechanisms to extract that information, but we also need to have a way to tap into the intentions and wishes of the person who would receive that information. Because depending on the task or what they want to pay attention to at any point in time, you want to present the right information. So one of the neat things about the BrainPort and the voice that I like so much is that they're trying to get as close as they can to the raw visual information. You know, that's why it's so noisy, right? Especially if you play an image of the Himalayas, you know, there's so much noise happening there. But we're dealing with that same noise in vision. You know, it's just we've had our whole development to learn to overcome that variation and extract patterns from it, extract the relevant information we need. The same with sound, right? So if you go to a country where you don't know the language, everything blurs together. You can't even tell where one word starts or another word ends. But obviously, if you learn the language, you learn to segment things appropriately. And so certainly one of the wishes here is to provide people that power to use their segmentation abilities, their attention abilities, to extract the information that they want when they want it.
Steph, you're having a question?
I was polite
Thank
for
you.
once and raised my hand. I've been wondering about the perspective taking with the tactile stimulation on the tongue. And it's quite interesting that it changed with the pattern. So the question is, do they employ some kind of prior context? Is it reminiscent of something for them? Do you have any insight into this?
So the best we could get from the explanations they were using is that they were trying to get a sense of the shape, and there certainly appeared to be some sort of priors they were developing based on their interpretations of the ambiguous shapes that came before that. And so, for this, we did not have a chance to do a full sort of trial by trial analysis for each participant who's, because they saw sort of a random order of these ambiguous shapes in the study. And it's quite possible that once they interpreted something from a certain orientation, they then tried to interpret the following pattern using that reference frame to do so. And depending on which pattern was then presented, they may have more or less confidence in their interpretation of it. So if, for example, you have the arrows, sort of like a rotated V, right, going around different directions, if they interpret it as a V, then they might be very confident that they know what that is. Once it's at another orientation, suddenly they might think, well, is that a letter V that's been turned and I got it wrong the last time? Or is that an arrow telling me, which way is up, down, left, right? And if instead they interpret it differently the first time, then I think that would have subsequent effects again on how they'd interpret it. And so definitely, I think that you get this combination of uncertainty and past experience that's influencing how they interpret what comes after that.
Any more live questions? Ella, do you still want to say something?
I can continue asking questions for like an hour. I'm not sure everyone wants to stay for this. I'll ask one more small question. You mentioned that when people were trying to integrate information from the tongue display unit, and the voice, they were using the voice for the gist and the tongue display unit for the detail. And that completely surprised me. I would expect them to do the exact opposite of this. Can you comment on that? Do you think that stems from the level of the pixel size that you provided for the voice and for, like, it's kind of when I think about sensory substitution, I think about the voice's advantage in terms of giving detail, but less in terms of giving the gist, because you need to integrate that over time. And the second thing is, with regard to the brain port, did you ever try to provide the information for the brain port consecutively and not at the same time? So to provide it in a screening way, comparable or faster, but at least in a screening way so that people can integrate space better.
Okay, I'll answer the second question first. No, though that is something we've wanted to do across senses, just to get a better comparison of sort of baseline abilities for being able to integrate an aperture over time, because I think obviously that creates a real interesting problem regardless of the sense you're presenting to, right? To be able to do that temporal integration over a period of time again and again. So no, but I think that would be fascinating to do. But back to your first question, Yeah, my expectation was exactly in line with yours. So with the voice being able to represent so many pixels compared to the brain port, I also would have thought they would use that for those details rather than the brain port, which is only presenting 396 versus the 25,000 potential with the voice. I think there's two reasons that came out different in this study. One is a bit on the practical side, which is that something we noticed people were doing with the brain port, and we didn't restrict this, is that they would move it around on their tongue.
Your head.
So
yeah.
It partially for comfort, right? So they would kind of, even not even touching it, they would just sort of with like their mouth and lips, move it back and forth on their tongue. And so they were actually doing active sensing of it.
Amazing.
By moving it across their tongue. In part because we also notice certainly the acuity of the tongue is not homogeneous, and there's a higher sensitivity towards the tip than towards the back. And so many times, if the location they were trying to disambiguate was, say, further back, because it's the top of the object that's going there, you would see them kind of move, kind of like push it out with their tongue to get to the tip and then slide it back again. And so I think that active exploration, and it's actually something Bacarita talked about a bit, that he found people were using with a lot of his training approaches, is perhaps something very important, because with the voice, you're getting it a somewhat active feeling exploration, right? So you get the scan happening, and so there's something dynamic about that. And you can turn oftentimes, not in this case, but you can sometimes turn and over time get a sense of information changing, perhaps getting it to your sweet spot in terms of the frequencies you hear best. But in this case, they could really only do that with the brain port, and that active sensing seemed to really help them work out the details. Because if you have sort of an edge of say a triangle, which might with the voice actually be hard to distinguish from a circle, right? So particularly early on, that they sound very similar. But once they're moving that around with the brain port, they get a sense that there's sort of a corner there that they can detect perhaps at some orientations better than others as they're shifting it around in their mouth.
They're not moving their head. I would think that people would use moving their head for this.
Well, in this case, they couldn't because the camera was fixed.
Okay.
Because that was the only way we could present exactly the same spatial locations to both at the same time. So they couldn't move their head, they could only move it on their tongue. But also in this case, the image quality presented to both was the same. So we were sort of disadvantaging the voice in that regard. And so, even though we know people can do the voice with a downsampled image, they were unable to take full advantage of its capabilities in the way we presented.
There's a question from Peter in the chat, so I think we should get that, even though, again, I could continue here.
Okay, let's open that up here. So, hello, Peter. Good to have you here. Will you be using eye tracking in combination with sensory substitution devices? Might further support active sensing. This is something I'm very interested in, particularly Giles Hamilton Fletcher, who did his PhD with Jamie Ward and is now working in New York. I was fortunate enough to examine his fascinating PhD, and he did do some eye tracking work within it related to the output from the voice. And I think in particular, because many people who are not congenitally visually impaired, but became visually impaired later in life, are the most interested in vision restoration. And they already have an ability, even if they lose a little bit of that ability over time that they're visually impaired, to control their eye movements. That does provide an interesting way to have that sort of active sensing, both in the sense I was just describing now, where they can sort of sweep over locations of interest as they want to, but also going back to that idea of the relationship between what we hear and what we see. So as you hear an area of interest coming from the voice, being able to have that active sensing and shifting the eyes would give them an opportunity to restrict the information to an area of interest. It would give them a chance to reduce the amount of information they have to deal with, perhaps in an active way. So, and going back to the earlier question from Yag, computer vision can maybe do some things to provide that, but really the intentions of the person are really important. And I absolutely agree that eye tracking could be one way to help provide that signal of intention and then provide the person with the information that they want. And in fact, actually, so I'm working with the eye tracking team here at Facebook Reality Lab. So I'm definitely seeing a lot of potential for how these different sensors and technologies can work together.
Great, thank you very much. Actually, I had a very similar question on this topic because you showed this natural scene that got translated into sounds. And actually, a lot of the information that gets translated is not really relevant for navigating through the scene. So a lot of sky, for example, is translated and is very loud because it's bright. A lot of the distant mountains, these are not really important for navigating, right? Much more important would be the stone wall that was right in the front, right? So this is important for the blind person or visually impaired person not to run into. So it's actually a rather small number of pixels that are actually important for the person, and there's a huge amount of pixels that get translated that are not really important. So, and of course, in vision, we have our eye movements and our visual attention to filter all this out, but training this with auditory attention must be really difficult. So I wonder whether one can maybe have a combination with computer vision and do at least something like foreground, background segregation or something, and only translate the objects in the foreground, let's say, and leave out the background, something like this.
Yeah,
again,
absolutely.
Going a bit into this information reduction direction.
Yeah, it's a great idea. And because, right, so on the one hand, we can do these things monocularly, right, in terms of being able to pick on the depth of things. So if we can do it monocularly, we can, in a sense, potentially do it with another sense, right? If we provide the information, we could somehow pick up on those monocular depth cues to know, what we want to listen to, though it's incredibly challenging to do based on the sounds you heard, of course. And so there are certainly some interesting ways that could be done. Some automatic. Peter, for example, is always working with the coding and the different sort of camera sensors that are available to think about how he can do that directly with the voice. My PhD student, Mike Richardson, well, he worked with Giles and Jamie at Sussex before coming to Bath, and they worked on different other sensors and cameras and similar sensory substitution devices that could represent the distance of things. So that way you could even make an active choice that you only want to hear things that are near you or far away, but not both at the same time. And so I do think, again, depending on the task, so if you're wanting to avoid obstacles or go hiking in the Himalayas, that could be really useful.
Great, thanks very much. Jack has raised his hand again.
Hi, yeah, thanks a lot for your answers to the earlier questions. As somebody who studied bat echolocation, I can't not say that there's a lot of interesting principles about using sounds for visualizing your environment. I would strongly encourage you to perhaps look at some of the bat echolocation literature, because some of those principles, I think, could be used in some way in your method of, using sounds to see your environment.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Actually, right now I have a paper under review with Alexandra de Souza where we're looking at sort of the natural history of blindness, basically. And so looking across a number of different species and how well they can see and how that's compensated with other approaches that might inform and be translated to approaches with humans. We do find we're struggling with reviewers where we either have reviewers who study non-human animals and they think, well, of course, this is obvious. And then we have reviewers who study humans and they're like, well, why would we want to know what happens in non-human animals? And so we're really trying to work on our final revision right now to to try and make clear to each group, which clearly you understand, the relationship between studying this as a broader fundamental problem. Because absolutely a lot of the work on echolocation is fascinating, not only in terms of like navigational type things, but like recent work, I was so excited to read where they're looking at the spatial frequency profile of processing by bats with these 3D printed waveforms to show different spatial frequencies, you know, as a perfect analog for the same thing people study in vision in humans. And it just blew my mind. You know, it was so nice to see that translation between the two. And I absolutely agree. I think that's very useful to think about the natural ways other species have evolved approaches to solve these problems without vision. And I definitely think we can learn a lot more from that.
Yeah, thank you. And, you know, humans use echolocation as well. So I think that, you know, a distinction between human animals is not that big, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Tyler's work, for example, in echolocation is wonderful, both on the just the behavioral side alone and the training of it, but also the neuroscience side. So trying to do retinotopic mapping of echolocation in humans is really cool.
Okay, we've had quite a long session. So if there aren't any other questions, I think we can wrap up. Unless somebody has a really urgent question, it's short and still want to, you know, go ahead. But otherwise, yeah, I think we're probably going to relieve Michael now. It was a really fascinating talk. Thank you again, Michael. Stephanie, do you want to announce who we are going to have next week?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Thank you for everybody who held out. Next week, we are going to have Ione Fine, and I hope I see you again then.